Devyani Khobragade, India's Deputy Consul General in New York, was arrested by Manhattan U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara's office today. Handcuffed while dropping her daughter to school earlier on Thursday, Khobragade was released on a bail of $250,000. Khobragade was charged for allegedly making and presenting false statements in a visa application to the U.S. Department of State for an Indian national employed as a babysitter and housekeeper. Her lawyer's first line of defense will be diplomatic immunity and says such a public arrest of an Indian diplomat is unprecedented. Meanwhile, the Manhattan U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara said foreign nationals brought to the United States to serve as domestic workers are entitled to the same protections against exploitation as those afforded to the United States citizens. The false statements and fraud alleged to have occurred here were designed to circumvent those protections so that a visa would be issued for a domestic worker who was promised far less than a fair wage. This type of fraud in the United States and exploitation of an individual will not be tolerated. Now, in a response to the media query, the Indian Embassy has stated, "We have been informed that the Deputy Consul General of India in New York, while she was dropping her daughter at school, Dr. Khobragade, was later released that same evening. Action was apparently taken against Khobragade on the basis of allegations raised by the officer's former India-based domestic assistant, Ms. Sangeeta Richard, who has been absconding since June this year. In this context, the Delhi High Court had issued an interim injunction in September to restrain Ms. Richards from instituting any actions or proceedings against Khobragade outside India on the terms or conditions of her employment. The U.S. government had subsequently been requested to locate Ms. Richard and facilitate the service of an arrest warrant." Well, NDTV's Namrata spoke to the consular's officer's lawyer. Here's what they had to say.
In your past experience with other, government officials, and especially those holding such a high diplomatic post, is this the first that has happened of such a nature? I mean, is there a precedent of a case of such a nature?
Well, if what you're referring to is that she was arrested on the street while dropping her daughter off at school, I think there is no precedent for that, and hopefully there never again will be such a precedent. It's shocking to me that she wasn't provided with an opportunity to do what any responsible person would do, and that is, if they wanted to talk to her, she would have come with her attorney and spoken to them.
So the U.S. government never made her that offer at all?
I've not been made aware of that ever happening.
And just to go to the case details, I know there is not a lot that you will talk about, but the fact that an initial contract was signed for $4,500, I believe the Deputy Consul General's salary itself is $4,000, so it's not technically possible for a contract of such a nature to really take place.
You make a very good point. I can't comment.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Arshak. Thank you. I really appreciate you speaking with NDTV.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
All right, so that is the big story we're tracking this morning as Ms. Khobragade was arrested, as you heard there, her lawyer saying arrested as she was on her way to school and was dropping off her daughter. Well, Namrata Brar joins us on the phone line from New York. Namrata, a complicated case. It seems the Indian consulate was also searching for this woman who has now filed these charges against Ms. Khobragade. And the question everyone in India will want to know is why was she arrested like this as she was dropping off her daughter handcuffed in public?
I think that's the first sense of shock, Bharti, that everyone is, at least in the Indian government circles, getting when they got this news earlier this morning. The fact that she was handcuffed and publicly arrested, and as you heard the lawyer Daniel Ashik saying, that they could have easily reached out, and the lawyers in the Indian government would have been more than willing to come to their offices. There was no need to make a public spectacle of such a nature. The first time it has happened with any diplomatic official here in the United States in relation to a case of such a nature. Now, the second big question that everyone's also going to be asking is diplomatic immunity. Now, I believe the lawyer's first line of defense is going to be diplomatic immunity. In fact, at the courtroom today in the first hearing, that's what they argued on. Whether Devyani Khobragade was in her official capacity when making this visa request completely changes the equation versus comparing it that she was in a personal capacity while making this request for a visa for this employee, Sangeeta Richard. And then, as you mentioned, the case against Sangeeta Richard, who has been absconding since June of 2013 in Delhi, in the High Court, also puts a new twist to this. And one final larger question is the fact that how can Indian government officials, particularly at these diplomatic posts, afford to pay American salaries? I understand this is a violation of American wage rules and they take it very seriously here. But just to translate it, $4,500 amounts to 2,80,000 rupees for your personal assistant. And Devyani Khobragade, in her position, earns only $4,000. She has a husband who's an academic who has been moving around with her wherever she goes in terms of diplomatic positions. He's currently a professor in Canada, but is definitely not someone that you assume will have those kind of resources. But just the Indian government has to relook at the salary structure and then try and figure out how they can afford to pay domestic help, particularly for two young daughters that she does have.
All right, Namrata. Now there have been problems like this in the past as well with Indian diplomats bringing domestic help there to the US and of course not meeting the standards there. But meanwhile, what about this lady in question? She has been absconding. There was a case against her in the Delhi High Court, and in fact the Indian consulate, it seems, had asked for her to be brought to them or be arrested.
Yes, Tagi, the Indian consulate, the Indian embassy, in fact, of the United States has issued a press release on this, and they have said Sangeeta Richard is being tried and has an arrest warrant under the sections 420 and 387 under the Indian Penal Code, and these basically amount to causing some kind of grievous hurt or injury. Some people also talk about hurt to reputation or a fraud to the employer. So we are allegedly assuming that there was some altercation that took place earlier in the summer of this year, and that led to Sangeeta Richard presumably contacting the Department of Labor or the State Department, and that's how the case came to light. But these are facts not verified by either the defense counsel or the prosecution. These are early days. The first hearing, as I said, was today at 500 Pearl Court in the court in Manhattan. She was released on the $250,000 bail bond, in which even Indian government officials came in and signed it. It's just bail bond, so Indian government officials were present. They are definitely present during this case. And the next hearing date has been assigned for January 13. Between that period, there could be conversations. There will be a lot to be discussed, both on the Indian legal front, the Indian diplomatic front, and obviously on a personal front about exactly what went wrong in this contract and how much of a fraud was conducted.
All right, Namrata, thanks so much for joining us. With that, Namrata Brar there reporting from New York on this case of an Indian diplomat arrested in public, handcuffed in public in a case of visa fraud. As even her lawyer was saying, it's an unprecedented situation that a diplomat is arrested in this manner. There could have been a better way of going about it.